We don't need your pathetic pension cash anymore. Just go die somewhere else. My own son's voice echoed through the glittering banquet hall as laughter followed, stripping me of every ounce of dignity. But the ticket they flaunted wasn't his, it was mine. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Diana Miller, and at 71 years old, I believe I had seen the best and worst life could offer. I had buried a husband, survived on a modest pension, and poured every ounce of love and strength I had into raising my only child, David. Through sleepless nights, medical bills, and the constant weight of debt, I told myself that one day he would be my comfort, my pride, the proof that all my sacrifices had not been in vain. For years, I clung to that hope, even when David drifted further from the boy who once hugged me at the school gates and into the man who barely called unless he needed something. Then came the night that split my life into two halves, before and after. It was a Friday evening, the air thick with the smell of cheap takeout boxes littered across the living room. David and his wife, Melissa, were sprawled on the couch, a bottle of wine half-drained between them. I was in my chair by the window, knitting with stiff fingers, half listening as they bickered about bills, cars, and the endless grind of money slipping through their hands. That was when David pulled a crumpled lottery ticket from his jacket pocket. Melissa laughed at first, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Don't tell me you wasted money on that nonsense again." David smirked, scratching the ticket with a coin. "Just wait." And then it happened. A pause. A sharp intake of breath. Melissa's eyes widened, and David's hand began to tremble. The room filled with a strange silence, broken only by Melissa's shriek. "David, 15 million. We won." For one fleeting heartbeat, I felt joy blossom in my chest. $15 million. Enough to pay off their debts, enough to secure their future, enough to lift the crushing weight that had pressed on my shoulders for decades. I imagined us sitting together at a table, planning carefully. A bigger house where we could all live comfortably, a nurse to help with my aching joints, maybe even a trip to see the ocean I'd always dreamed of. In that instant, I believed fortune had finally smiled on us all. But the illusion shattered as quickly as it had formed. David turned to me, his eyes no longer soft or familiar, but sharp and cold. The corners of his mouth twisted into a sneer I had never seen on my son before. "You hear that, Mom?" he said, his voice dripping with triumph. "We don't need your pathetic pension cash anymore. Just go die somewhere else." Melissa's laughter followed like a knife through my chest. She leaned into him, wrapping her arm around his shoulder, as if sealing a pact against me. Finally, she said, her voice full of venom, "We can live without dragging dead weight along." I sat frozen, the knitting needles slipping from my hands onto the carpet. The words echoed in my ears, "Pathetic pension cash, go die somewhere else." Each syllable struck harder than the last, as if they weren't just words but stones hurled straight into my chest. For 71 years, I had lived through hardships, but nothing had prepared me for the cruelty of being discarded by the very child I had given everything to. David stood, towering over me, his face flushed with excitement and arrogance. "This is our house now," he said. "Our life. You don't belong here anymore." Melissa didn't look at me. She simply pulled the wine bottle to her lips, her eyes already glittering with visions of yachts and diamond rings. I wanted to argue, to remind them whose hands had scrubbed these floors, whose sacrifices had kept the lights burning when David was a boy with shoes worn to the sole. I wanted to scream that I was still his mother, flesh of his flesh, the one who had held him through fevers and heartbreaks. But the words stuck in my throat, drowned by the humiliation of their sneers. Instead, I rose slowly, my joints stiff, my heart heavier than it had ever been. I gathered my old coat from the hook by the door, the same one I'd worn for years, its pockets frayed and empty. Behind me, I could still hear their laughter, their giddy planning for a future where I had no place. Melissa called after me mockingly, "Don't forget your suitcase, Diana. You wouldn't want to leave your knitting behind." I stepped into the cold night with nothing but that suitcase and the echo of their voices. The door shut behind me with a finality that felt like a coffin lid sealing. On the dark street, the world felt unreal, as if I had been pushed into some nightmare where the ground itself rejected me. I clutched the suitcase to my chest and whispered to myself, $15 million, and I am worth nothing. My breath turned to fog in the winter air, but the chill that seeped into my bones came not from the wind. It came from betrayal. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. The door shut behind me with a slam that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I stood on the front steps with my suitcase in one hand, the night pressing in cold and merciless around me. Behind the walls I had once called home, laughter spilled out. Melissa's shrill and triumphant, David's drunken and self-satisfied. Their voices carried through the thin glass of the window, mocking me even when I was no longer welcome inside. I clutched the handle of the suitcase until my knuckles whitened, trembling not from age this time, but from the raw sting of humiliation. I could hear the distinct clink of crystal glasses inside, Melissa toasting her victory. To us, she crowed, her voice sharp as a knife, no more leeches weighing us down. David's laugh followed, a sound I once cherished when it was the giggle of a little boy chasing fireflies in the backyard. Now it was cruel, hollow, and filled with arrogance. They hadn't just won the lottery. They had stripped me of my dignity and tossed me aside like the threadbare clothes I kept mending year after year. All those nights I'd stayed awake by candlelight, sewing David's torn school uniforms, budgeting every penny of my pension to stretch meals so he'd never go hungry. Those sacrifices had meant nothing to him. As I stood there in the dark, every memory of raising him flickered through my mind, tainted now with the bitter taste of betrayal. The first time he fell and scraped his knees, and I carried him all the way home in my arms. The way he clung to me after his father's funeral, sobbing that he didn't want to be alone. The pride I felt when he graduated high school, when I whispered to myself that all the struggle had been worth it. And now, this same boy, my boy, had looked me dead in the eyes and told me to go die somewhere else. The heartbreak was unbearable, like glass shattering inside my chest. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not there, not with their mocking laughter echoing through the walls. I turned away from the door and walked down the street, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the corner where the glow of a street lamp pooled in the darkness. There, I stopped, the weight of everything collapsing onto me. That was when it began. Not the quick, fiery kind of anger that burns out in an instant. No, what stirred inside me was slower, darker, something that grew in silence like embers smoldering in the ashes of a fire. It wasn't the pain of being poor or even the fear of being alone. It was the hatred of a mother betrayed by her own flesh and blood. The kind of hatred that seeps into your veins and sharpens every memory of kindness you once gave. I hated Melissa for the way she laughed at me, her eyes glittering with cruelty, as though my very existence was a nuisance. I hated the way she wrapped her arm around David, whispering poison into his ear, turning him against me. But more than her, I hated David, my son, my only child. Because deep down, I knew Melissa could not have sent those words without his permission. He had chosen her over me. He had let her voice drown mine. He had condemned me, his mother, to the cold night without so much as a flicker of remorse. I stood under the street lamp and felt that hatred burn slow and steady. It gave me strength where my body had only weakness before. My hands stopped trembling, my breath steadied, and though my heart still ached, it no longer beat with the helplessness of grief. It pounded with resolve. Hatred does not bloom overnight. It coils itself around your soul, tightening a little more each time you remember the betrayal. And that night, every remembered smile from David, every echo of his childish laughter, became twisted reminders of how far he had fallen. The child I raised was gone, and in his place stood a man who had traded blood for fortune. The night stretched on as I lingered under the glow of the street lamp, my suitcase at my side, my body weary yet my mind sharper than it had been in years. I realized something. They had not destroyed me. They had tried to erase me from their lives, to shove me into the shadows like an inconvenience. But hatred, once born, does not die easily. It feeds, it fuels, and it waits. As the minutes passed, the cold air seeped into my bones, but I welcomed it. The chill reminded me I was still alive, still breathing, still capable of feeling something stronger than despair. Melissa's laughter still echoed faintly from the house behind me, but I no longer heard it as a wound. I heard it as a spark. They thought they had cast me aside like trash, but trash has a way of resurfacing when least expected. And as I finally gathered my suitcase and walked into the night, I knew this. My story with David and Melissa wasn't over. What had been broken inside me was no longer fragile. It was forged into something harder, colder, and more enduring. Hatred had become my armor. And in that armor, I took my first steps away from the life I had lost and toward the reckoning that would one day come. Within days of the lottery win, David and Melissa shed their old skin like snakes and stepped into a life of glitter and arrogance. They bought a sprawling mansion on the edge of town, a monstrous house of stone and glass that towered above the oaks like it was meant to sneer at the world. From the outside, it looked like a palace, with white pillars rising up to a balcony, a fountain in the driveway spraying water, as though money itself flowed from its basin. A row of luxury cars gleamed under the sun, sleek black sedans, a red convertible, and even a silver sports car that looked more like a spaceship than something meant to drive on a road. I watched from a distance once, standing by the wrought iron gates, gripping the bars as though they could steady the storm within me. Servants in crisp uniforms moved like shadows inside, carrying trays of champagne glasses and imported cheeses. Women in sequin dresses drifted across the marble floors, their laughter ringing like wind chimes, while men in sharp suits puffed cigars on the terrace. My son had built himself a kingdom overnight, but I could see even then that it was built not on stone, but on vanity and excess. The first banquet came only a week after they moved in. A cascade of cars lined the driveway, spilling guests onto red carpets Melissa had rolled out herself. I lingered at the edge of the property, my presence unnoticed by them but very much aware to me. The sound of crystal glasses clinking carried across the lawn, along with Melissa's high-pitched laughter. Through the tall windows, I saw her standing in the center of the room like a queen on her throne. And then I heard it. She thought we needed her pennies. Now we're millionaires, Melissa said, her lips curling with mockery. Her friends shrieked with laughter, tossing their heads back as though the cruelty of her words was the finest entertainment of the evening. I froze where I stood, the words digging into me like claws. She thought we needed her pennies. Those pennies had been my life's blood. They had been the money I tucked away from my pension, the careful dollars I spared when I skipped meals, the little cash I slipped into David's hands when he was short on rent or gas. Those pennies had been the difference between him standing on his feet or collapsing in shame. But to Melissa, and worse, to David, they were nothing but scraps, an old woman's pathetic offering. The anger that surged through me was different from the hatred I had felt before. Hatred sat heavy and silent, but anger burned, alive and restless. It filled my chest, clenched my fists, and threatened to spill from my lips in a scream I barely suppressed. They thought money had erased blood. They thought a bank account could replace decades of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and the bond between a mother and her child. David stood beside Melissa that night, a glass of champagne in his hand, his arm draped around her waist. He laughed when she mocked me. Laughed as if I were not his mother but some unwanted relic to be ridiculed for amusement. His smile was wide, his cheeks flushed with wine and triumph. He didn't even flinch at her cruelty. That was the moment I realized he had not been led astray by Melissa alone. No, he had chosen this path himself. He had chosen wealth over blood, pride over love. I felt anger coil in my stomach like a snake ready to strike. It wasn't the wild fury of someone seeking revenge in the heat of the moment. It was a deeper, older kind of anger, the kind that simmers until it hardens into resolve. Each insult, each laugh at my expense, added fuel to the fire. I remembered the nights I had rocked David to sleep when storms rattled the windows, whispering promises that I would always protect him. I remembered working double shifts at the diner, my hands blistered from scrubbing dishes, so that he could have shoes without holes in them. And now he stood in his marble palace, mocking me as old baggage. The mansion glowed with light that night, but all I saw was the rot beneath the surface. Every chandelier sparkled, but to me, they looked like cages of crystal, trapping David in a prison of his own arrogance. Every car gleamed, but I saw them as coffins on wheels, carrying him further away from the man he had once been. I walked away from the gates that evening, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Anger pulsed through me with every step. It was no longer the quiet ache of betrayal, but the fierce knowledge that something had to give. They believed money had made them invincible, but I knew better. Wealth built on cruelty and arrogance never lasts. As I disappeared into the darkness beyond the mansion's glow, I whispered to myself, blood cannot be erased, not by money, not by greed. And though my voice was quiet, the anger inside me roared, alive and unyielding. Wealth, I came to realize, does not change a person's character. It reveals it. And once the glitter of David and Melissa's fortune settled, the truth began to show through the cracks like rot spreading beneath polished wood. David, once careful to hide his indulgences, started drinking openly, shamelessly, as though alcohol were another trophy to prove he had made it. He never held just one glass of whiskey. He demanded a bottle and then another. Servants whispered about him stumbling through the marble hallways, yelling at paintings when no one else was awake. More than once, he was carried to bed by the very staff he paid to bow before him. His cheeks grew bloated, his eyes dull and red-rimmed, the sparkle of new wealth quickly corroded by intoxication. Melissa, meanwhile, treated money like it was air, something infinite, to be consumed without thought. She bought furs in the middle of summer, purses that cost more than a year of my pension, and jewelry she flaunted but never wore twice. She ordered cars, only to sell them weeks later when a newer model caught her eye. She even imported exotic flowers to line the driveway, blooms that withered within days under the wrong climate, thousands of dollars thrown away for the sake of temporary beauty. And surrounding them, the so-called friends. At first, their parties overflowed with laughter, champagne, and adoration. Everyone wanted to bask in David and Melissa's glow, to sip from their glasses and pose in front of their fountain for pictures. But I noticed the way their smiles curled when David turned his back, the sly exchanges of glances when Melissa boasted about her exclusive purchases. These were not friends. They were scavengers, circling the feast while the hosts, blind with arrogance, mistook them for admirers. Whispers began to follow. At the grocery store, in the bank, even at church, I overheard mutterings. David had invested in schemes with men who had reputations darker than night. money was being funneled into businesses that existed only on paper. Lawsuits were whispered about, letters delivered by stern men in suits who left more often with threats than smiles. I heard that checks bounced, that accounts drained faster than they could be filled. But even as cracks widened, David and Melissa kept up appearances. They still opened their doors to banquets, still raised glasses high, still mocked me when my name was brought up. She's probably counting pennies in some dark corner. I overheard Melissa sneer once, surrounded by jeweled women who nodded along. Pathetic, really. David roared with laughter, clinking his glass to hers. "We're untouchable now," he declared. "This house will never fall." Yet I could see it in the way the servants moved more stiffly, in the way Melissa's so-called friends started pocketing bottles of wine when they thought no one was watching. I could see it in the strain around David's jaw, the brief flashes of panic in his eyes before he drowned them in liquor. Their empire was not untouchable. It was fragile, and the storm was already rumbling on the horizon. One evening, I lingered near the gates again, drawn to the golden glow spilling from their windows. Music played, guests danced, but I noticed something different. The laughter was louder, but forced, brittle like glass about to shatter. Melissa wore diamonds on her neck, but her eyes darted constantly, watching the crowd as though afraid someone would discover a secret she was desperate to keep hidden. David stumbled during a toast, slurring his words, and instead of applause, I heard muffled giggles. His kingdom was turning on him, and he didn't even notice. Anger simmered inside me as I watched, not only at their cruelty to me, but at their blindness. They thought their glittering life was proof of superiority, that money made them invincible, but all I saw was weakness parading as strength. They laughed at me still, mocking the woman who had given them everything, and yet they were the ones being hollowed out by greed, pride, and lies. The mansion, with all its chandeliers and marble, had become a stage, and David and Melissa were the actors in a tragedy they could not yet recognize. Every toast, every purchase, every cruel word to me was another crack widening, another warning ignored. They didn't know it, but the storm was already beneath their feet, gathering force, waiting for the moment to break. And I, cast aside as old baggage, could see clearer than anyone else how fragile their empire truly was. The glitter was already fading by the time the truth revealed itself. The parties were smaller, the champagne cheaper, and the laughter thinner than before. Melissa had begun snapping at David in public, her smile brittle, her voice edged with contempt. She spent her days prowling the mansion in silk robes, clutching her phone, calling lawyers, calling banks, calling anyone who could reassure her that the ground beneath her feet wasn't crumbling. It was late one night, after another shouting match with David, that Melissa found herself in the study, the grand oak desk buried under a mess of documents. Bills, contracts, investment papers, evidence of a fortune slipping like water through their fingers. She rummaged through the pile with manic energy, her red nails clicking against the paper as if she could claw out some salvation hidden between the lines. And then, almost by accident, she uncovered it. A folded envelope, yellowing at the edges, tucked between tax documents and a half-empty checkbook. She pulled it free, muttering under her breath, irritation creasing her forehead. She slit the paper open, expecting perhaps another bill, another debt. But instead, her eyes fell on the familiar numbers, bold and unmistakable. The lottery ticket. Her heart lurched as she unfolded it, her gaze racing over the lines of text. She had seen copies before, of course. They had framed one for the living room in their early days of glory, flaunting it as though it were the crown jewel of their empire. But this one was different. This was the original. And there, printed in black ink that no amount of money or arrogance could erase, was a detail she had never noticed, or perhaps had never wanted to notice. The ticket wasn't registered under David's name. It was mine. Diana Miller. My name, not Melissa's. Not David's. Mine. For a moment, Melissa's breath caught in her throat, as though the walls of the room had closed in around her. Her hand trembled as she held the ticket closer to the lamp, rereading the line again and again, hoping her eyes were deceiving her. But there it was, unyielding, undeniable. The $15 million they had spent, flaunted, wasted. It had never been theirs to begin with. I remembered the night I had bought it, not because I expected anything from it, but because small indulgences were sometimes all I allowed myself. I had slipped the ticket into my handbag, thinking little of it, and later, distracted and tired, handed it absent-mindedly to David when he asked if he could scratch it. He had done it with a smirk, the kind of playful arrogance I had grown used to, and then the numbers appeared, changing everything in an instant. But what he never understood, what Melissa had never cared to check, was that the purchase had been mine. The ticket was mine. And the fortune, the empire, the glittering palace they had claimed, rested on a foundation that did not belong to them. Melissa staggered back from the desk, her silk robe brushing against the papers scattered on the floor. She pressed a hand to her temple, her mind racing. For the first time in months, the mask of superiority slipped. Fear crept into her eyes. She imagined, perhaps, what would happen if the truth surfaced. That all the cars, the jewelry, the mansion itself could be stripped away in an instant, reclaimed by the rightful owner. That their enemies, the creditors and lawyers who circled like wolves, would seize the opportunity to devour what little remained. That David, already drowning in his own arrogance and weakness, would crumble entirely under the weight of this revelation. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Melissa snapped upright, clutching the ticket as if it might dissolve in her hands. David's voice called out drunkenly, slurred and impatient. She shoved the envelope back into the pile of papers, her pulse racing, her breath shallow. She forced her features into calm before he entered, but her hands betrayed her, shaking as she poured herself another drink. Inside her chest, a new terror took root. For all her cruelty, for all her venom, Melissa was not blind. She knew what it meant. The empire she had mocked me from was built not on her wealth, not on David's cunning, but on my absent-minded indulgence, my small purchase at a corner store. The fortune had never been theirs. It was mine. And though Melissa might have buried that knowledge in the bottom of a drawer, hidden it behind laughter and bravado, the truth was not so easily silenced. Truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. That night, Melissa lay awake, her mind consumed not with diamonds or parties, but with fear. Every laugh at my expense, every word of mockery, every insult hurled at me. It all trembled now under the weight of the revelation she had uncovered. She had married into a kingdom that did not belong to her, and her throne, gilded though it appeared, was nothing more than stolen wood. And while she might have kept her lips sealed in that moment, clutching the secret to her chest, she knew, as I knew, that the storm had finally begun to break. The knock on my door that night was not the arrogant pounding of a man who thought the world belonged to him. It was weak, hesitant, almost childlike. For a moment, I didn't move. My body stiffened, my heart caught between curiosity and dread. But when the knock came again, softer, almost pleading, I rose from my chair. Every step toward the door weighted with the memories of his cruelty. When I opened it, the sight before me nearly stole the breath from my chest. David stood there, unshaven, his clothes damp from the drizzle outside. His once polished shoes were scuffed and worn. His expensive jacket sagged on his shoulders like a borrowed costume 2 sizes too big. His eyes, red, hollow, desperate, met mine, and for the first time in years, there was no arrogance, no sneer, only emptiness. "Mom," he rasped, his voice trembling, "please, I have nowhere else to go." For an instant, I felt the old reflex, the maternal instinct to pull him into my arms, to shelter him from a storm. But then the memory surged. His voice, sharp as a whip, sneering, "We don't need your pathetic pension cash anymore. Just go die somewhere else." The wound he left with those words had never closed. I gripped the doorframe, steadying myself. "You may come inside," I said slowly, measuring each syllable, but not without conditions. He blinked, confusion flickering across his gaunt face. "You will stay here," I continued, my tone firm, unyielding. "But understand this, David. Respect is worth more than any fortune. You lost everything because you forgot that simple truth. You traded blood for money, love for arrogance. If you want a place under my roof, you will remember what respect means." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking in a courtroom. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he would argue, if the last shred of pride in him would lash out. But instead, David fell to his knees, the weight of his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. His shoulders shook as he sobbed, his forehead pressed against the worn wood of the entryway. "Mom," he choked, his voice breaking, "I wish I could undo it all. I wish I could take back every word, every laugh, every night I treated you like nothing. I don't know what I was thinking. Melissa, the money. It all swallowed me, and I didn't see what I was becoming." His tears darkened the floorboards, each drop carrying the weight of squandered years. I stood over him, anger still alive inside me, pulsing hot and steady. Yet mingled with it now was pity. Pity for the boy I had raised, for the man who had lost himself in greed, for the son who had mistaken wealth for worth. I bent down, slowly, and placed my hand on his shoulder. His body flinched as though my touch carried judgment, and in a way, it did. "David," I said, my voice low, "tears will not erase what you did. Apologies will not undo the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering how my son could cast me aside like trash. You are broken, but perhaps broken is the only way you will learn." He lifted his head then, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a desperate hunger, not for food, not for money, but for forgiveness. I did not give it freely. Forgiveness is not a coin to be handed out like spare change. It must be earned. "Listen to me," I said, straightening, my hand still heavy on his shoulder. "I will not throw you out tonight. I will not let you sleep on the street like you once let me. But understand this. Your place here is not a gift. It is a chance. And if you cannot respect me, if you cannot learn from the ruin you built with your own hands, then you will walk out that door again, and this time it will stay shut behind you." David nodded furiously, his sobs breaking into hiccups, his words tumbling over each other. "I'll do anything, Mom. Anything. Just don't leave me. Don't turn me away." I pulled my hand back, folding my arms across my chest. "I already left once, David. You pushed me out with your own hands. Now it's you who's come crawling back. Remember that. Remember who opened this door tonight when no one else would." The room fell silent except for his ragged breathing. I turned away from him, my steps slow, deliberate, as I walked deeper into the house. Behind me, I heard him shuffle inside, no longer the king of a marble palace, but a penitent man entering his mother's modest home. Anger still boiled within me, a wound not yet healed. But somewhere beneath it, pity stirred, quiet and fragile. He was broken, yes, but maybe, just maybe, broken was the only way he would ever learn. When I let David through my door, it was not as my son reclaiming his rightful place, but as a guest stepping cautiously into a house he no longer recognized. My living room, with its faded curtains and worn couch, was a far cry from the marble halls he had once strutted through. And that was precisely the point. The mansion had belonged to arrogance, but this modest home belonged to reality. I made it clear from the beginning. "You may sleep here," I told him, pointing to the couch with its sagging cushions, "but do not mistake this for entitlement. You are not here as my son, basking in unconditional forgiveness. You are here as a man who has lost his way, who must earn back every ounce of respect he squandered." David nodded, his head bowed low, his eyes darting around the room as if ashamed of its simplicity. The same man who once mocked me for my pension now placed his blanket neatly over my couch each morning, grateful for even that small corner of shelter. I found him odd jobs through old acquaintances, work he would have once sneered at. Fixing fences, unloading trucks, washing dishes at the diner down the street. The first morning I watched him leave, dressed in borrowed clothes that smelled faintly of mothballs, he looked like a shadow of the man who had once laughed at me over crystal glasses. His hands, soft from idleness, soon blistered and cracked. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, stooped under the weight of honest labor. At first, he resisted in small ways. He muttered complaints under his breath, his pride raw and aching. "I'm not meant for this," he grumbled one evening, staring at his sore palms. I fixed him with a steady gaze. "You weren't meant for cruelty either, David. But that didn't stop you from inflicting it." The words silenced him. Slowly, the muttering stopped. The grumbling gave way to quiet reflection. His arrogance, once so loud and blinding, began to dull. Each day he returned home later, his body tired, but his voice softer, less sharp. He ate the meals I placed before him with gratitude instead of disdain, cleaning his plate like a boy who remembered hunger. One evening, I caught him sitting at the table long after dinner, staring into his hands. His voice broke the silence, rough and hesitant. "Melissa never loved me, did she?" I did not answer immediately. He needed the truth, not comfort. "She loved the money, David. When the money was gone, so was she. Love does not vanish when fortune fades. It grows stronger. What you had with her was not love. It was a bargain." His face crumpled, not in shock. He had known, deep down, all along, but in resignation. The mask of denial he had worn for so long finally cracked. He pressed his palms to his face, whispering, "I traded everything for her. For nothing." I said nothing more. Lessons are not learned through speeches. They are carved into silence. Over the weeks, I noticed small changes. He rose earlier, no longer dragging himself out of bed when the sun was high but ready to work at dawn. He folded his blanket each morning, wiped down the table after meals without being asked, even offered to carry my groceries from the market. They were simple gestures, but they were seeds of humility sprouting in barren soil. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, he lingered near the window, his eyes far away, as if replaying the nights in the mansion when laughter filled the air and I was the object of their ridicule. His lips pressed into a thin line, shame carved deep into his features. For the first time, I saw not just guilt but understanding. He was beginning to feel the true weight of his cruelty, not as a passing regret, but as a permanent scar etched into memory. He spoke less of himself and more of others. One night, he told me about a man at the diner who worked 2 shifts to send his daughter to college. Another evening, he recounted a woman at the truck stop who gave him a sandwich when she saw him struggling with the load. He had never noticed such things before, not when he was drowning in luxury. But humility had stripped his vision clean. I watched him carefully, never quick to forgive, but willing to see. A mother's love does not die, but it hardens when betrayed. I let him earn every inch of my tolerance, every crumb of my patience. Slowly, day by day, I saw my son learning what Melissa had hidden from him, what money had blinded him to. That respect, dignity, and love are worth more than any mansion, any car, any fortune. And though anger still burned in me, it was tempered now by pity, and perhaps, just perhaps, by the faintest flicker of hope. The months that followed were slow, deliberate, and filled with lessons no fortune could ever buy. David rose each morning with the sun, his shoulders heavy, but his steps steadier than they had been in years. He worked hard, harder than I had ever seen him. And each evening he came home with tired hands, the kind of tired that comes not from indulgence, but from effort, from labor that etches meaning into a man's soul. I watched quietly, never praising too quickly, never offering more comfort than he had earned. Forgiveness was not mine to hand out like charity. It was his to pursue through action, humility, and time. And slowly, day by day, he began to shed the skin of arrogance that had once clung so tightly to him. Then, one evening, it happened. David walked through the door, his jacket smelling faintly of oil and dust, his palms rough and lined with cuts from the day's work. But in his hand he held something new, something that carried more weight than any gleaming trophy from his days of false grandeur. It was a folded envelope, creased from being held too tightly, the corners worn from his nervous grip. He set it on the table between us and slid it toward me. "This is for you," he said softly. I looked down and unfolded the paper. Inside was his first paycheck, earned from weeks of honest labor at the repair shop. It wasn't millions. It wasn't even thousands. But it was clean, pure, a symbol of humility forged in sweat and sacrifice. My hands trembled slightly as I held it. I thought of all the checks I had written over the years, rent payments, grocery bills, school supplies, each one carefully signed with hands that never shook because I couldn't afford the luxury of trembling. And now, for the first time, my son was offering me something in return. Not because he had to, not because he wanted control, but because he finally understood. When I looked up, I saw his face, no longer bloated from drink, no longer twisted with arrogance, no longer shadowed by Melissa's venom. His eyes were clear, steady, and softer than I had seen in decades. "Mom," he whispered, his voice rough but certain, "I finally get it. Money isn't power. It isn't mansions or cars or people cheering your name at parties. It's respect. It's love. It's family. Without that, you have nothing." Tears welled in my eyes then, unbidden. Not the hot tears of anger, not the bitter tears of betrayal, but tears born of something deeper, satisfaction. The kind that comes when the scales of justice balance themselves without your hand, when life itself delivers the lesson you had prayed for but never believed would come. I thought back to the night they cast me out, their laughter ringing in my ears, Melissa's cruel voice telling me to go die somewhere else. I thought of standing in the cold, clutching my suitcase, my heart breaking into pieces. And I thought of how far we had come since then, of the storm that had torn David down to his knees, stripping him of everything until only the truth remained. Justice had been served, but not by me. I had not raised my hand in vengeance. I had not plotted his downfall. Life itself had been the teacher, and it had been merciless. Yet in its cruelty, it had carved out space for redemption. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused, the skin of a man who had finally learned the value of work. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not heavy this time. It was full, rich, complete. "I haven't regained the money you lost," I said softly, "but I think I've regained something more important." He swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. "Your son," he whispered. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. In that moment, I knew I had not lost him forever. Fortune had taken him from me, twisted him into someone I barely recognized. But ruin had returned him, humbled and broken, yes, but real. And in that ruin, there was truth. There was the son I had raised, the boy who once clung to me after his father's funeral, who once promised he'd take care of me someday. The mansion, the cars, the champagne. It had all been an illusion, a glittering lie that left nothing but ashes. But this paycheck, these words, this quiet evening across the kitchen table, was real. I had not lost a son to fortune. I had regained him through ruin. And for the first time in years, I felt not sorrow, not bitterness, but peace.